Посередине здания. Прям посередине, третий этаж.
Посередине? Прямо посередине здания. Третий этаж посередине.
Hello. Oh, no, we don't want that. Hello, how is everyone? Hello. I forgot just how long that opening is, so I added on a bit more, but seeing how long that opening video went on for, I figured I'd probably actually speak to you all before this turns into a half an hour long opening segment. So, provided there are no audio issues, hello everyone, how is everyone doing? I hope everyone is going well. And I'm sure you have all heard by now that it has finally happened. Depending on what event that you mark the start of the battle with, 8 months, 9 months ago, the battle for Bakhmut had begun between forces of the Russian military, including a Russian private military corporation, which I am not going to name because of breaking up you. Hope that's a joke. The audio is okay. Unless there is an audio issue, someone let me know one way or the other, because I don't want to get into the whole spiel and then have to repeat it because the mic is off. A bit less, but your mic feed was breaking up. Test. Can I get a quick mic test? Hope this isn't a troll screen with me because it's completely thrown off my... It's fine here. Okay, I've just lost my entire train of thought, so we'll repeat that and I'll clip that out for the video. So, I'm sure as most of you have heard, it has finally happened, depending on when you state the start of the battle itself, be it 8 months ago, 9 months ago, or even since around about December, whenever they began to physically enter the city itself. The Battle of Bakhmut has finally come seemingly to an end, at least in the city center itself. The forces of the Russian Federation, the Russian military, supported by units of the DNR and the LNR militias, alongside a Russian military, private military corporation, of which I am not going to mention by name because of YouTube's arbitrary policies. They'll just be referred to as the Orchestra and the man who runs it as the conductor. But I'm sure you all are fully aware of who and what I am referring to whenever I use those terms. Have fought for months in a grinding attritional battle through the city of Bakhmut, and as of today, which is steadily being corroborated by more and more Ukrainian sources, but was first announced by the conductor himself and by his organization's Telegram pages. They have announced that they have secured full operational control of the metropolitan area of Bakhmut. So, long time coming. We were kind of expecting it in February, then in March, then in April, but we have finally reached the end, at least of the formal battle itself. There is still fighting going on in around Bakhmut, but in terms of the fight for the city itself, that appears now to be over, at least the first stage of it. So, just to give you all a idea and a conception of just where we are talking about and where things are going, sure as you have all come to enjoy my beloved map streams, we are going to be looking at map and specifically focusing on this part of the map of Ukraine. So, over the past week, the Ukrainian defense in Bakhmut was steadily being whittled down. I believe a large part of that was the Ukrainians starting to withdraw their units alongside the attrition of the battle itself. But slowly but steadily, the Orchestra was gaining ground and pushing out the Ukrainians in the last built-up sections of the city that they still held. Alongside this, there was Ukrainian counterattacks, which are still ongoing to the north and southern flanks of Bakhmut, which have proved a bit more successful for the Ukrainian offense there. And the Russians slowly but steadily are materializing a more cohesive defensive line to stabilize those parts of the front. But in between those two Ukrainian counter-thrusts in the city itself, the entire city has now passed to Russian, or the Orchestra's, control today. Just to give you an idea, This yellow territory is, I believe, this is around about the last week's worth of gains. So the Ukrainians had a pocket here to the northwest of the city, and here to the southwest. This area was the area that has fallen today. Ukrainian troops seem to have withdrawn from. This is the area where the infamous MiG monument, for which most of the battle became fairly famous, as this was the main point where Ukrainian troops rotating in and out of the city would pose or at least photograph the MiG monument as they passed. The MiG monument was an old Soviet-era MiG-15 jet put on a pedestal, specifically exactly here. I hope this shows up well on the stream. And that is the location of this area. It was destroyed by the Ukrainians around about, I think, a month and a half ago, because this part of the city actually fell to the Orchestra in an earlier part of the battle, but the Ukrainians were able to retake it back. But now it seemed irrevocably lost to the Ukrainians for the near and at least medium term, if not forever. So this is the MiG monument. This was area up here was the old Soviet residential area of Bakhmut. You had a lot of old Soviet era Khrushchevkas, Brezhikas, the old Soviet era commie blocks, large residential apartment buildings, fairly sturdily built. And if anything, this war is turned out to demonstrate, they can be turned into veritable fortresses. But nonetheless, this is what this area was, and was kind of the stronghold of the remaining Ukrainian effort in the city. Another aspect, as some of the footage from the opening video showed, and I'm sure if you are in the Telegram channel or have viewed my previous streams on Bakhmut, you will be aware that I talk a lot about two specific roads that go into the city. The Northern Road, which, as you can see, leads straight into the previously held part, the Ukrainian held part of the city, and the Southern Road, which leads into the MiG monument access into the city. Now these roads have pretty much lost any sort of strategic value they had for the Ukrainians, because obviously if the city's lost, they are no longer functional as a method of logistics and resupply into the city. So it's finally here. Very big propaganda victory for the Orchestra, a symbolic victory for Russia, a symbolic defeat for the Ukrainians. But there's been a lot of blood spilt on both sides. I know I sort of, in my Telegram channel and some other places, I kind of try to put a bit of a comedic flair to a lot of the stuff like this I talk about. But just to remind people that we are talking about an event over the past few months that has cost potentially around about 50 to 60,000 lives of people who would otherwise been alive but have been killed to fight for the city. So the sheer loss of numbers is quite significant. Just to put this in comparison, if I'm not mistaken, I'll just double check my figures here, but the entire coalition losses for the 20-year-long engagement in Afghanistan was, I just have a look here. Oh, that's not what I'm looking for. 3,612. Those are not including the Afghan National Army. That is all NATO and coalition personnel who were killed in Afghanistan over a 20-year campaign, was 3,612. And if we just want to have a quick look at Iraq, just for another comparison. Yeah, and I know this is probably more of a Western-centric point of view rather than a more ecumenical point of view, but we're just looking at coalition losses, just kind of get a scope of what's happened here. Why is it so hard just to get a quick and fast figure? You'd think if you just Googled this, it would just bring you up an immediate figure straight away. If I'm not mistaken, I believe the total coalition losses in Iraq for the entire time there was around about 6,000 men. I can't corroborate that immediately off the top of my head because apparently this figure is not something you can immediately Google and have a fairly accurate, up-to-date assessment on. But the point is, what I'm trying to make is, we were talking about over the space of around about 8-9 months, is you've had around about 10 times at least, potentially up to 20 times, 20-year battle deaths for coalition in Afghanistan. And these figures we'll never really probably know half accurate figures for the total casualties lost in Bakhmut to either side, but either way, these are sort of guesstimates that are floating around. We are talking about a significant loss of life that's happened in the city itself, and I'll delve into what those figures might mean for both sides as I progress through the stream. So just to look at the tactical situation of what we have at the moment. So the Russians, after they took Lysychansk and Severodonetsk, which is in this area here, after their breakout of Popasna last summer, the Russians rapidly were able to force the Ukrainians out of Lysychansk without a grouping or urban battle. They spread out and formed a new sort of defensive line along here. Then they made significant efforts to try and push up towards Bakhmut. The reason why the Russians seem to have encumbered Bakhmut so much is because just north of Bakhmut, between Bakhmut and Soledar, is this road that leads right up to the twin cities of Sloviansk and Kramatorsk. Sloviansk and Kramatorsk are the two remaining major urban areas that are part of Donetsk Oblast that are not under the control of the Russian Federation or the DNR. After the fall of Mariupol last year, these are the two sort of big remaining cities. It is also the base of the Ukrainian administration in the rest of the Oblast, of what they hold remaining of the Donbass area. Of course, there is still a significant territorial section of Donetsk Oblast that the Russians don't control, but nonetheless, the cities are kind of the big strategic goal that the Russians were going for. So if they could take the road to Kramatorsk and Sloviansk, that would put them on a good setting as of last year, around about midsummer last year, to achieve their stated goal for the war after the failure of the initial invasion. The other thing to remember at this time where this strategy seemed to have come about is the Russians were also in Krasny Liman, in this area here, and they were also pardon me, up here in Izium. So it was potentially, if the Russians still held this territory, of course they lost it through the mic is weirdly stereo. Sometimes it's flipping left and flipping right, but we can hear you. Is this happening for anyone else, or because I haven't changed any of the settings on the microphone, it should be perfectly. Now I've kind of lost my train of thought. Can I just get a final mic check? Is this happening to anyone else, or is it running smooth? OBS. I mean, as far as I'm aware, it should be running perfectly fine on my end. I've not changed any settings, so mic sounds fine to me. Proceed, all good. Okay, if anyone says anything else about the mic stuff, I'm not interrupting the stream anymore. This is twice. I don't know what the problem is, but if it's happening for most people, then I'd stop the stream and sort it out, but it only seems to be happening like the one or two, so I honestly don't know. I'll have to come back and check after the stream. So hope it works out. If not, I can't keep interrupting the stream and ruining my train of thought. So back to it. So as I was saying, whenever the Russians were sort of conceived of the idea to take the road to Sloviansk and Kramatorsk, which would bring them into the inevitable battle of Bakhmut, Russians were in Izyum and they were in Krasny Liman. So they were on the northern flanks, potentially of Slovyansk and Kramatorsk. But then, of course, the Ukrainian Lightning Kharkov offensive happened, and the Russians lost this entire northern flank. But by that stage, the Russians were starting to become invested into the Battle of Bakhmut itself. So, in a sort of a roundabout way, the strategic imperative for Bakhmut was kind of lost to a degree to the Russians there. This sort of need to take Bakhmut and this road to Slovyansk and Kramatorsk, with the idea of potentially investing and besieging the cities, made a lot more sense if the Russians could push down from the north and invest them from the north and cut off the cities completely and put them under siege. Whenever the Russians lost those northern flanks, Bakhmut, I'm not going to say it lost its strategic value to the Russians, but the Russians were potentially already too invested in the city to kind of call it quits from their efforts towards it. So the Russians already began the battle for Bakhmut, push into it, and then the sort of strategic need to take Bakhmut was kind of downgraded by the Ukrainian success in the Kharkov offensive. But nonetheless, despite that, the Russians still remained committed to taking the city itself, but they kind of passed the buck to the orchestra. And of course, as I mentioned at the start, I'm sure most people are aware who I'm talking about whenever I talk about the musicians, the orchestra, or the conductor man. But they were sort of given free reign of this wing of the front. So don't know if I need to go too much into it, but the orchestra is a Russian private military contracting agency. It does a lot of work in Africa and did a lot of work in Syria. It's considered sort of like a dark arm of Russian diplomacy and Russian influence abroad, especially in Africa. It allows plausible deniability to the Russian state for some military operations that benefit the Russian Federation abroad. It allows a bit more leeway for the Russian military to operate, particularly in places like Syria. Sort of things like this. They were heavily engaged in Africa and in Syria. They didn't really have a presence in Ukraine at the start of the war or for months starting it, up until around the failure of the Russian initial invasion. After that, it sort of became apparent to the Russians that there were certain things going on fairly wrong with them in their operations in Ukraine, and they started to look for extra manpower and extra combat power which they could bring into theater to support them. And that is where the conductor man brought in his orchestra to assist the Russians as much as he could. There's a lot of nuances in this. Maybe I could do a stream specifically on the orchestra, but who knows with YouTube, I don't know, but I'll try and talk about them in an ethereal way. At some point, whenever the Russians began their investment of Bakhmut from the east, the orchestra and the conductor man, probably for a large part of it, was for domestic political capital back in Russia, particularly to curry favor in Moscow with Vladimir Putin and to build up a domestic political support base. The conductor man offered his group to relieve pressure on the front by taking over a section of the front, and at that time it was growing to be one of the most intensive parts of the front itself. So what happened effectively? It'd be what would have been the lines back then. This is before the fall of Soledar, so you're talking the lines would have ran somewhere around in this location, somewhere around there. You had the Russian army, the Russian military at this stage, we're talking around about late last summer going into the autumn, just before mobilization. The Russian military had a significant, serious problem with manpower. It was struggling on the front. It had lost the initiative to the Ukrainians. As part of the way to relieve that pressure on the Russian military, conductor offered to take over the Bakhmut section of the front by his men that he would pull from his personal private army, the orchestra. And that is whenever you've seen that he would go around and he would recruit prisoners from Russian jails, who would pull in anyone he could to make up numbers for his combat units. because you have to understand is that the orchestra is not just one hegemonic block. There are different sections to it. You have the professional core of the orchestra. These are your professional, if you could call them mercenaries or whatever. These are your professional, well-trained, committed combat core of the orchestra. These are the people who know what they're doing. These are the people who go to Syria. These are the people who go to Africa. These are the people who seem to have led the charge during the battle of the city, inside the city. So we're talking over the past couple of months. Then outside that, you have sort of a new recruit base, probably people who have just come out of the Russian military, ex-contractors, kontraktniki, people with a bit of combat experience who have something that they could offer, but they aren't professionals. They haven't made a name for themselves. That's sort of your more outer core. And then below them, you had your sort of your penal, I don't want to call them conscripts, but your penal volunteers, the prisoners, the people recruited from Russian penal colonies, the scum off the streets, disposable people, people who don't offer anything. If they're killed, they're not going to be missed. If anything, they're killed. But the fact that they will be killed is kind of probably in some ways like a benefit to Russia. The kind of people who were recruited and told, if you want to redeem yourself, you redeem yourself on the battlefield by running at a Ukrainian trench. We'll deal with this group first of all, because a large part of the battle, especially through last autumn, was spearheaded by these men, these very disposable troops, very poor training. They might have had a couple weeks combat training, refresher training, learned how to fire a rifle, very basic squad tactics, very, very remedial training. But these are going to be hard men. Again, the Russian prison system, if you know anything about it, is not a pleasant place. It breeds callousness. It breeds hard, strong men, but disposable men in this regard. So those were the people who, for a large part of the opening stages of the battle, were sent into southern Bakhmut and into eastern Bakhmut, largely, effectively, what seems to be literal cannon fodder. If they could make a gain somewhere, that was good. If they didn't, well, the fact if they got destroyed or killed in the field is they would reveal Ukrainian position that more professional orchestra units or Russian artillery can focus on and destroy in time. So that's kind of the three stratas of the orchestra from my understanding, from what I've been able to observe. So the penal units were kind of the big story of the opening stage of the battle. And that is what went through the autumn, into the winter, into around about January this year. Because, of course, in January of this year, is they finally started to achieve a breakthrough towards the town of Soledar. And this is where the things started to really become undone for the Ukrainian defense of the city, and arguably is kind of the key of where we are today. So while you had these penal conscripts investing the south around Optruny, and then over in this area, so if people can remember back in the daily updates of the battle, like the south of Bakhmut is where the garbage station is. This part is the industrial zone and the gas station in this area. This is where the penal conscripts, the penal volunteers were heavily engaged. And it seems to be that through the winter, that their role was to tie down Ukrainian troops in this area, while more professional orchestra units, along with support from more professional Russian military units, such especially the VDV and some guards units, started to pick apart Ukrainian defenses up around Bakhmutsk and opened the door of the Soledar. Around about in January, if I remember my stream on it correctly, is these very well trained, very committed professional Wagner units that are very good on offensive and infiltration. They were able to slowly infiltrate and pick apart the Ukrainian defensives up in the north around Soledar. Then that opened up the key to the city. Once they managed to achieve a breakthrough here, that is whenever that sort of second rung of the orchestra, you're sort of better trained, probably ex-military, knows what they're doing whenever it comes to a fight, but not quite professional level, is the core of Wagner. That's whenever they came into play. That bulk of manpower was pushed into the front, into the Battle of Soledar. And without rehashing the entire thing, slowly fought their way through Soledar, started to push their way up through Blahotny, and then that sort of opened up the breakout and the undermining of the Ukrainian defenses to the north of Bakhmut. The Ukrainians didn't stay static for this. They seen that what was happening. They started to pull troops out of the south, which were still being encumbered by these penal volunteers. By pulling out strength from the defense of the south of the city to try and reinforce the north, that is whenever you had the penal volunteers along with some professional units of Orchestra, but also particularly elements of the Russian VDV, started to make gains in the south, and this is started to collapse the Ukrainian defensive ring around the city. Before this, most of the fighting around Bakhmut, so you're talking around about mid to late January, most of the fighting itself wasn't in the city itself. It was in the fields, in the small villages and small fields and towns surrounding Bakhmut itself. But whenever Soledar fell and the Ukrainians had to readjust their defensive lines, that is whenever you started to see the Orchestra and the Russian military start to push into the southern part of Bakhmut from Optoye, but also the Orchestra broke out of the Ukrainian defenses to the north of the city, started to push into these northern suburbs around Krasnohora, but also crucially, they started to push up the road to Slovyansk and Kramatorsk. Maybe it's because the Ukrainian defenses weren't able to adjust fast enough. Maybe it was because maybe the Ukrainian military had directed them to say, look, the original game plan is still on. The road to Kramatorsk is still the main goal here. But nonetheless, they made very respectable progress up the road before coming to a halt, and they've kind of been held here ever since Ukrainians were able to effect a defensive position here. Now, we come to the city itself. Krasnohora falls. That starts to undermine the defense of the entire city. So while Ukrainian troops are encumbered in the south, they're slowly being pushed from the eastern bank of the Bakhmutsky, because that's the name of this river here. Bakhmut sits in a river valley. So this terrain here is hills and mountains. This is above the city. As some of the footage from the opening video, you can see a car driving down into the city alongside wrecked Ukrainian vehicles on either side. That is this road here, but it's also similar on this road here. Bakhmut sits at the bottom of a river valley. To the east, I believe there is a bit of higher ground here, but that river valley is particularly evident from the west. So that is why there was the Russians and the Orchestra made a particular effort to try and push to the south and the north during the original breakout. And at some point, it seemed particularly close and probable that the Russians might have been able to effect a complete encirclement of the city. So, as you can see here, the Russians came especially close to cutting off the southern road. And at some points, they actually had a presence physically on this road. And it seemed at one point that they might even be able to push to Chasiv Yar. Needless to say, that did not come about. I could do a little spiel on missed opportunities for the Russians, because it's been a number of times where the Russians have fumbled the ball, it seems, and have failed to enact an encirclement that would trap a significant number of Ukrainian troops. Mariupol is obviously the exclusion to this, but nonetheless, the Russians were not able, well, the Orchestra was not able to effect this in Bakhmut, but what it did give them was fire control to a large degree over the roads in and out of Bakhmut. Fire control is whenever you can't physically stand on, you don't have control of an area where you can physically stand on it, but you can physically fire onto it, be it via artillery or direct fire with your handheld rifles, with tanks, whatever it is. So the Russians, by and large, had fire control over the northern and southern roads into Bakhmut for a significant amount of time, and that dealt a fair amount of attrition to the Ukrainian troops in terms of men and material, which is something I'll come on to in a little bit later. So we're talking about, were we into late February going into March whenever this happened? This is where certain interesting developments happened on the Ukrainian side. The Ukrainians started to. The background of all this was there was also the Russian spring offensive, which really didn't seem to achieve much. You're talking about, if people can remember, the scenes of the constant, seemingly suicidal attacks into Buldar. The Russians made some progress around the Divka, but also the attempt to try and push into Kupiansk, which didn't really go anywhere, is that there was a Russian spring offensive that kind of diverted resources from the orchestra in Bakhmut. But after the Russian spring offensive kind of petered out, we then began serious consideration and talk of the Ukrainian spring. Now, it might be potentially summer if it ever does happen, but there's a specter of Ukrainian counteroffensive that's been hanging over this. So while the fighting was going on to try and contain the breakout of the orchestra into Bakhmut, is the Ukrainians actually seem to release very little reserves and reinforcements into the city. Units were rotated in and out, but in terms of the actual Ukrainian military strength in the Donbass, is they seem to commit very little to the defense of the city overall. And a large reason for that is the Ukrainians are holding roundabout potentially up to 20 battalions of men in reserve for this coming hypothetical counteroffensive. These are the men who largely did Kharkov or largely did Kherson. The Ukrainian army group that partook in the Kherson offensive last year largely seems to have disappeared. The units involved in that really haven't made themselves known elsewhere along the front. And the idea is that these are the people who are being trained up and taught to use these Western tanks, the Bradleys, the Leopards, the Challengers. That's what these people are doing, and they're preparing and building up strength for this counteroffensive whenever and however it emerges. So what the Ukrainians did seem to do, and this is what the Ukrainians kind of did throughout, is there were some fairly competent Ukrainian troops involved in defense of the city, but by and large, the bulk of the Ukrainian defenders of the city have been some regular army units that were based in the area before the invasion began last year, but they've been augmented by a lot of your Ukrainian territorial defense battalions, your sort of reservists, your sort of conscripts. And I think that was part of the Ukrainian strategy, was to kind of slow down the Russians, but slow down the Russians with potentially your more second-rate troops to save your better units for future fights later down the road. So that was kind of what the Ukrainians seemed to do, is they didn't really seem to commit what they could have, in the same way that the Russians didn't really seem to commit what they could have to take the city earlier. The Ukrainians didn't seem to commit what they could have to fully hold the city, because there was a lot of Western commentators, Western military commentators, and I think I largely agree with this, is that the Ukrainian decision to hold the city was probably more of a costly one than it could otherwise have been, because Bakhmut at this stage of the war doesn't generally hold a real strategic importance to either side. The road to the north is pretty much out of action. It's going to be a long time before the Russians ever get near Sloviansk and Kramatorsk. The dynamics of the entire theater have changed, which I think has kind of robbed Bakhmut of its strategic significance to a large degree. But it was a political and a symbolic significance that kept both sides invested in the struggle for the city. The Russians, the orchestra, because of the men and blood spilt there, and the sort of connotation of this is Ukraine's quote-unquote Stalingrad. And then the similar on the Ukrainian side, because so much material has been expended in the defense of the city, and this is quote-unquote our Stalingrad, to wear down the invader as much as we can. I think that's seems to have been the thing that took over the priority on both sides, is the sort of symbolic and political connotations of victory for either side in terms of the city itself. So, well, we were into late February, into March. This is whenever the fighting in central Bakhmut really picks up. The orchestra managed to get across the river from the east They push up from the south, they push in from the north. The Ukrainian defenses in the city start to collapse, but there is a slow, grinding, attritional urban battle that continues throughout. You have both sides' artillery are constantly raking the city. You have the Ukrainians begin demolishing buildings as soon as the orchestra take them. You have Ukrainian armor units piecemeal start to come into the city to provide fire support. But interestingly, while you did see it in smaller numbers, as you didn't really see a lot of armor or mechanized warfare from the orchestra or the Russian side. But that is kind of the nature of the combat that went on here. There's as far as the Wagner, forget, I'll scrub that out for the video that I'll merge out of this. As far as the orchestra is concerned, it seems to be far more a manpower and artillery fight for them. In terms of the Ukrainians, for much of the battle in the city itself, as they had a mix of mechanized units supported with armor, supporting their infantry. However, over the past couple of weeks, it looks like the Ukrainians withdrew a lot of their mechanized and armored units. So you had the Ukrainians, particularly along this red line, which is the railway, as they attempted to fortify all the positions to the west of the railway. You're talking your old communist era residential apartment blocks, the stadium, the train station. Whenever one of those fell to the orchestra, the Ukrainians had mined those various buildings to be demolished, to just blow up, which slowed down the orchestra a bit. So we're starting to come into late March, into April, up until the present day. At some point, the orchestra pushed up and captured the southern road into Bakhmut, but they were repulsed by Ukrainian counterattacks. And then you're bringing up to the stage where this Ukrainian, you're talking about the last couple of weeks, you had the Ukrainian counterattacks on the northern and southern flanks. Still open for debate. What is the Ukrainian mindset behind this? I think it's the Ukrainians not trying to save the city. I think it is the Ukrainians trying to set the stage for what is to come after the fight for the city. I think the Ukrainians have realized for probably the past couple of months that the city is going to fall. It is inevitable, and it was inevitable at that stage. It was about buying time and trying to jockey for more favorable positions in the aftermath of it. So we'll move to the flanks. As I was briefly mentioned earlier on, this is hilly and mountainous terrain that overlooks the city itself. But also, you're talking about a high ground that looks further out towards the east of the steppes. And then to the west as well, you start to, it's not quite steppe as in you're talking in the Zaporozhye area, but it's more flatter terrain. You do have some river valleys, but the hills behind Bakhmut are some of the highest ground in this part of the combat theater. Further to the north, you start to come up into the forests and the more mountainous areas up and towards Kharkov Oblast. But nonetheless, it's kind of the significant feature in this area is the hills around Chasiv Yar leading up to Bakhmut. And I think this is kind of the strategic play that the Ukrainians are starting to go for and have been going for quite a while. Because if you're up in these hills, you can fire down into the city. This is why it was pretty crucial that the Russians took these originally, because they could fire down onto these roads heading into the city and potentially into some Ukrainian positions from the rear. Whenever the Ukrainian counterattacks come, they push them back, opening up the roads slightly. But I think the Ukrainian play here was to try and push the Russians and the orchestra as much off this high ground so that they could establish a more defensible position going forward. So I don't think I need to explain too much, but if you're trying to fight up a hill, just any hikers, any hill walkers and stuff, you'll know it's pretty exhausting going up a fairly steep incline. Imagine doing that in combat gear while being fired at. If you can put a defensive position on top of a hill or a mountain, well, you're pretty well set then. You've got a lot of advantage over anyone who might attack you. Well, if you've got two people who are on that high ground itself, if you try and push one off, it puts you in good stead for the other. So if the Ukrainians could potentially try and push the orchestra and the Russians back off these hills to some degree, I don't think the Ukrainians have any mindset to retake Bakhmut anytime soon. But if there is any potential future Russian attacks out of Bakhmut, say towards Chasiv Yar, this gives the Ukrainians a significant advantage. So I think that's kind of the play that we're looking at now. This is post Bakhmut, so we're talking from here on out, and since the Ukrainian attacks in these areas began. This is the Ukrainians trying to establish a more defensible position going forward. Potentially, it opens up to any Russian units that might be future based in Bakhmut to Ukrainian artillery fire off this high ground into the city, stuff like that. That could be a potentiality of what the Ukrainians anticipate here. But in general, if they could just try and hold this high ground, I think it would significantly complicate Russian operations on the northern Donbass part of the front in this theater. Because the other thing, which I kind of elucidated earlier in the Telegram channel, I do not expect that we will see the Russian military try and go further beyond Bakhmut anytime soon. The next logical conclusion, if you're just looking at a flat map, is Iviansky. If forgive my pronunciation to native speakers, I don't speak Russian or Ukrainian to any fluent degree. But then Chasiv Yar. Chasiv Yar is kind of the strategic strong point for the Ukrainians in this part of the sector. Any units going in and out of Bakhmut pass through Chasiv Yar. This is where the Ukrainian staging ground is, where new units coming in have also been building up combat strength, massing in power. Chasiv Yar is kind of the next significant target if the Russians were to progress from Bakhmut to somewhere else, but I can't see that happening, especially since the Russians are starting to be pushed back on the southern flank. Again, this is high ground. If the Russians aren't able to reverse these Ukrainian tactical gains here, I don't think there's any real opportunity for the Russians to push on to Chasiv Yar. So whenever the Russians were pushing on this area, there was talk that people could hear firing in Chasiv Yar. If you were walking in the streets, you could hear the fighting on the edge of the city. Because again, this is high ground. This is sort of your continuous high ground. So there isn't a significant disadvantage to one side or the other. Whereas now, with the Russians starting to be pushed back on the southern flank, if the Russians try to push out of Bakhmut, they're going to come into the same problem that the Ukrainians had trying to resupply Bakhmut. Again, this is a valley. Ukrainian troops on these northern, western, and southern flanks of this river valley here will be able to fire on any Russian troops trying to push out of Bakhmut, and it will become a turkey shoot for any Russian operations that might try to push out of there towards Chasiv Yar. So, with the caveat, we all don't know the future, and there's mopping up operations, and there's still fighting on the northern and southern flanks that are still very much in contention at this stage. Depending on how these go, I think this sector of the front is going to go quiet, significantly quieter than what we've been expecting. I don't see the Russians having any significant ambitions with what they are currently able to achieve to push on Chasiv Yar, let alone try and push up the road to Slovyansk and Kramatorsk. That's kind of the situation as I understand it now regarding the fall of Bakhmut. Is the Russians have their symbolic victory, their political victory, and the Ukrainians kind of have a symbolic defeat, but which will lead me on to a bit more of the nuance in this in terms of what has both sides lost through their fight here. As I was saying earlier on, the Ukrainians, I think, have suffered more of a material loss in terms of vehicles, the equipment that they deployed into the battle. Aside from some of the more... Forgive me, I'm just going to get a quick drink. Aside from some of the more elite units that were rotated through, a large part of the manpower loss on the Ukrainian side, as I was saying, were these territorial defense units. You're talking about your second-rate units. I know it's kind of cold-hearted to speak of men's lives this way, but it is war. Your territorial defense are kind of your Ukrainian conscripts or volunteers who have a degree of training. They can fight. You put them in a trench, they'll probably be able to hold it in most cases. but they're not exactly going to go out and win a war for you, or they're not going to go out and capture a well-defended position. That's what the bulk of the Ukrainian defenders in Bakhmut were, and that seems to be what the bulk of the Ukrainian losses were. To some degree, replaceable. How much well, in a military sense, replaceable. Of course, we are talking about people's lives here. But in terms of the more painful loss, I think, for the Ukrainians is in terms of the material. So as I mentioned earlier, is that there were armored and mechanized units that were operating in Bakhmut. There was videos of Ukrainian BTRs, BTR-4s, BMPs operating in the city at some sections. You also had at least one, potentially two Ukrainian tank companies operating in the city. And one of these tanks companies was one of the elite ones. If anyone follows the Ukrainian side of things, you've probably heard of Bunny. Bunny was a Ukrainian-operated T-80 BVM, which was captured from the Russians. I believe it was like last October. So this was a famous tank in Ukrainian service that they had captured from the Russians that was nicknamed Bunny. It had been prominent for the Kharkov offensive. The crew of that tank are pretty elite at what they do. They were active in the city. The crew survived, but the tank got bogged down in a road, in a ditch, and had to be destroyed. There's also other examples of Ukrainian T-80s and some captured formerly Russian T-72 models that were destroyed in the city. Those tanks a bit harder for Ukraine to replace, and I think especially potentially the crews, if they were part of the Bunny group. The Bunny group, from my understanding, is a pretty elite veteran part of the Ukrainian tank corps. So if those crews have been lost, they'll probably be very missed and hard to replace for the Ukrainians. So there was at least a few tank losses. The road in to Bakhmut was under pretty much constant Russian artillery fire. So there's significant examples of Ukrainian vehicles, be it light vehicles, trucks, cars, moving up to your BMPs, BTRs, and a couple of tanks that have been destroyed on the northern and southern roads into Bakhmut. So I think for the Ukrainians, the manpower loss is probably fairly steep, but I think it's the material loss that the Ukrainians are probably going to feel the most. Although saying that, it does appear that the Ukrainians over the past at least month were able to successfully withdraw the majority of the armor and mechanized units that they were operating in the city. So there are definitely Ukrainian tank losses in the city, but we aren't talking about like a Ukrainian tank company completely wiped out or something like that. It does appear that, especially since this northern flank was pushed back in the recent weeks, that the Ukrainians used that to withdraw some of their more valuable men and material from the city. So that is that's on the Ukrainian side. On the Russian side, I think it's more of a manpower loss than a material loss. There were instances of the Orchestra and the Russians using tanks and some light mechanized units, but very much this was an infantry and an artillery battle on their end. So the units involved, obviously the Orchestra took the lead role in it, but you also had the Russian VDV re-emerged. I think some of their units after reconstitution and rest of last year's mauling at various parts of the front assisted the Orchestra in their efforts here. They all seemed to fight as infantry, light infantry or heavy infantry, whatever way you want to define it. It was an infantry and an artilleryman's war on their part. It's hard to quantify, and the Russians will probably never release the figures in the same way that the Ukrainians will never release their figures, but your Russian losses, you're probably talking potentially at least double the Ukrainian losses. And the thing that probably did that was the way that the Orchestra employed their penal volunteers in the opening months of the battle, using them effectively as targets allocation for Russian artillery by getting Ukrainian positions to reveal their locations to them. The thing that they'll probably, the Orchestra, the conductor has said that he is withdrawing completely pretty much from Ukraine. He's going to focus on operations in Africa and the like. That is where your professional orchestra is really going to come into flare. But losses sustained in terms of Bakhmut in regards to the sort of outer and inner core of the orchestra. We have no idea, but you can, because of the nature of the battle and the nature of urban combat itself, we're probably talking a fairly steep loss of those two units. Not going to rehash previous streams, but of course there was videos, graphic videos, which the conductor put out, alleging that various internal factional politics in Moscow was causing a significant casualty figure for his men because of fiddling with the ammunition or undermining his troops one way or the other. Depending on what groups those are, I think for the orchestra at least, they'll feel their professional core the most. And then the outer core probably a bit more, because it would be the outer core people who distinguish themselves, and that sort of outer core of the orchestra would be the ones who would then replace the inner core. Professional losses. It's hard to quantify Russian military losses, because this was very much the orchestra's show. The VDV's probably taken some losses in this, but I think the VDV's probably come off a bit better than most other battles they've been involved in. The VDV were largely the sort of initial push to the south and the north of Bakhmut. This is where the VDV came into play. So after the orchestra took Soledar and achieved this breakout, the VDV came in to support them. And then whenever the orchestra hyper-focused into the city itself, it was the VDV that achieved this push up the road and this push to Chasiv Yar. As the fighting in the city itself really started to heat up, the VDV pulled out of these flanks, and then these flanks were replaced with your more second-rate Russian units. You're talking your Mobiks here. Maybe some of your DNR conscript units, but you're not your professional, well-trained Russian units were guarding the flanks. You had your second-rate units. This probably is reflective in the progress of these Ukrainian tactical counterattacks on both flanks. The fact that they fell on your less well-trained, less motivated, less capable Russian units. But it seems that the VDV has potentially been pushed out of the city over the past week to help shore up these defenses along with more capable units as well. So that's kind of the force allocation on either side. It's really hard to say casualty figures. Like I say, there's all kinds of figures going about, estimates. They'll be steep, but I don't know if we will ever really get a proper figure for them on either side. So if that is everything that springs to mind, I think that's kind of my hyper-focused bit on Bakhmut before we move elsewhere on the front. Just forgive me, I'm just trying to rack my brain to see if there was anything else of note. No, I think that's it. So, Bakhmut has fallen. Months in the making. Long prophesied. Slow to get there, but it's finally happened. The fighting's moved out of the city, and the story in the area is on these northern and southern flanks. Depending on how they go, if they solidify and stabilize, I expect this part of the front will probably go very dormant. Unless, of course, the Ukrainian counteroffensive decides to fall in this direct area, then who knows, maybe we'll have the second Battle of Bakhmut. Well, I guess this is technically the second Battle of Bakhmut. Maybe we'll have the third Battle of Bakhmut. Just for people who aren't aware, back in 2014, DNR separatists, DNR troops, did briefly engage in fighting for the city. I believe they took most of the city at one stage before being pushed out. So that is technically the first Battle of Bakhmut back in 2014. This is the second Battle of Bakhmut, and I guess if the Ukrainian counteroffensive decides to target the city, that would be the third, but they either or. This current present Battle of Bakhmut seems to be largely over. It's shaping operations now. It's trying to prepare the ground for probably a defensive game on both sides in this part of the sector. So, yeah. So now, we take it into a bit more of a strategic view of, we'll still talk a bit more about Bakhmut, but a bit more in an ethereal way. So Russian efforts in this area largely, I guess in some ways it's a bit mitigated because it was the orchestra who took the charge. So the Russian military technically hasn't really suffered too much out of battle. But what potentially has happened is the orchestra seems to be one of the far more competent elements of the Russian factions engaged in the war. So the question needs to be asked, was it worth it? And I'm kind of tending to, I don't think this potentially was worth it for what has been lost in terms of the time, the effort, and the men lost. Like, as far as we can tell, the orchestra is kind of disengaging from Ukraine now. It's going to focus elsewhere in terms of the more geopolitical struggle stuff. Was it worth it losing some of the more competent offensive infantry, which is something that Russia seems to really lack? The Russian military seems to lack is a good, capable offensive infantry, which Wagner, said it again, the orchestra excelled at. We might have to see in the months to come. Alongside this, the hyper focus on Bakhmut over the past few months, the fighting in Bakhmut, and on the flip side, the conductor was constantly complaining that the Russian MOD was undercutting his men via ammunition. On the flip side, the Russian military would say that there was too much ammunition going to the orchestra's effort in Bakhmut, whenever that ammunition could go to elsewhere on the front and achieve more. Maybe that's true. I kind of think the big thing that holds back the Russian military is just the incompetency and the poor commanders, the tactical and more strategic command that it's placed under rather than ammunition issues. But nonetheless, what I'm trying to get at is the months and the material and the men that were spent bashing their head against the wall in Bakhmut and then steadily bashing their way in and through Bakhmut. Could that effort have been used elsewhere? Could those men, could that ammunition, could all that combat potentially have been used better, say, up on the Kharkov front, where there's maybe a bit more favorable terrain for the Russians to try and put into Kupiansk? Could it have been better used down Kramina, trying to push Ukrainian back towards Liman? Could have been used potentially alongside the Russian spring offensive to try and properly achieve the encirclement of Avdiivka, or I'm not even going to say Volhadar because that's just a losing battle no matter what. Point of what I'm trying to say is all the effort, men, and time and material spent in Bakhmut, could it have been used elsewhere to achieve a better result? We'll never know. Considering how long the battle went on for, and this is the part of the Russian front that has achieved the most in terms of territorial gains. It's mixed results for the Russians is what I'm trying to say. There was a very particular permanent idea that went around, is that the Russians were never keen to take Bakhmut. It was all about destroying the Ukrainian army in Verdun style. That was never happening. That was never going to happen. Again, for the original point that I said, is since the initial invasion, his Ukrainian strategy in the Donbass was to keep, obviously because of the war from 2014, is that there was a lot of Ukrainian regular army units based along this front. And once the invasion happened, is the Ukrainians said, the Ukrainian strategy was to keep those pre-invasion troops and units at the front doing the same thing they'd always done. They dug themselves in for 8 years, and by keeping those units down on the front, those units would suffer high losses of men and material because they were constantly engaged in combat. But it was sort of this strategic play by the Ukrainians where if we sacrifice these units to delay the Russians and to bog the Russians down, maybe elsewhere we can build up combat power, train more men, equip more men and build up power elsewhere. This is what happened in Kharkov. So while the Ukrainians had the Russians bogged down in Kherson, in the Kherson offensive, and through the grinding through Bakhmut, through various units, a division of forces, they were able to arrange a new army group that surprised the Russians up in Kharkov and collapsed the front up there. So the units in Bakhmut, by and large, although, like I say, with the caveat, is you did have fresh units rotated in and out, it was the same units that kind of held the city throughout. So, the manpower loss for Ukraine is going to be steep, but I think it's probably ultimately been worth it in terms of expanding the Russian combat power. Pretty much the hobbling of the orchestra going forward, seemingly going forward, and the time that it has bought Ukraine by sucking in the Russian into this fight. That's kind of where I'm looking at it here. That's my assessment of it. I think right. So if you're looking for me to give sort of big terms to sort of quantify it, I'd say Bakhmut is a Pyrrhic victory for the Russians, and a success. This is going to sound strange, but a successful defensive defeat. I don't know if that makes sense for the Ukrainians. I think the Ukrainians got what they wanted out of the city, although they've lost the city. But in terms of the defense that they did of the city, is they've worn down the Russians and slowed them down to such a degree that they have gotten a strategic value out of it. So, again, I'll go to a World War II analogy here, because we all, everything has to be quantified by World War II, but we're going to look at the battle that everyone seems to only ever focus about, the Battle of Stalingrad. So just to try and put a historical analogy into what's happened in Bakhmut. So whenever the Germans in Operation Barbarossa began, 1942, you had Operation Untermehen Blau, Operation Blue, where German Army Group South had its main strategic objective was Baku and the oil fields of the Caucasus, to completely effectively cripple the Soviet Union during the Second World War. So while you had the German army broke out of the Soviet defenses in eastern Ukraine and rapidly expanded down into the Kuban and the Don regions and towards the Caucasus, a element of the German army started to push towards the land, well, now it's called Volgograd, but then Stalingrad, an industrial city of middling value strategically to both sides on the Volga. Stalingrad really didn't matter that much. If you looked at it, it was a reasonable industrial center, but it was kind of a main crossing across the Volga River, but it didn't have a lot of bridges. If you were getting across the river here, it was about ferries and the like. The Germans never really, as part of Case Blue, were looking to cross the Volga. The whole point of Case Blue was to take Baku and the oil fields of the Caucasus, but the Germans got invested in a battle around Stalingrad, and that is because of the name of the city, in a sort of roundabout way, not because of the name of Bakhmut, but in the same symbolic way. The Soviets decided, well, we're going to hold Stalingrad because it's named after Stalin. The Germans decided we're going to take Stalingrad because it's named after Stalin. The Germans pushed into the city, fought a grinding battle. The Germans eventually actually physically took the entirety of the city, but obviously we all know how history took, and I'm not saying this is going to happen to the Russians here, but we know that obviously Stalingrad ended up as a German defeat. But the point is, what I'm trying to say is the effort that the Germans put into taking Stalingrad, if they just, I don't know, decided to erect a more defensive line on their flank here and not put in all the effort into taking the city itself, the men and material that was expended in the battle to take the city could probably have pushed the Germans over the edge to get into the Caucasus and maybe not properly take Baku, but cut off the Soviet supply of oil from the Caucasus up. Or maybe the Germans could have decided to push to Astrakhan. there's a number of different aspects of what the Germans could have done during that operation, but instead they hyper focused in on Volgograd, and that slowed them down. It expended men, material that the Germans really couldn't face, and it weakened them in terms of an eventual Soviet counterattack in the area. That's not to say that Stalingrad didn't have its inherent worth. It was a bit of a logistics hub and a bit of an industrial hub, but in terms of the other things that the Germans could have done with that men and material, was Stalingrad really worth it? Probably not. It was all about the symbology of taking the city or holding the city. I'm trying to make that analogy for Bakhmut. Is all the effort and time that the Russians and the orchestra put into taking Bakhmut, was it worth it? Well, history is still to be written, but this is one thing that I think might come about, is maybe in the grand scheme of things, it wasn't worth it to expand all this men and material and time into this city that largely lost its important strategic value. Again, because of this road, whenever the Russians lost Liman and Izium. So that's kind of my assessment there. Just a short and fast one. So I think the Ukrainians probably in certain ways have achieved what they wanted out of Bakhmut to a degree, slowed the Russians down, bled out one of the better offensive units of the Russian factions in the war. Who knows? We'll have to wait and see how time goes forward. So that's just some of my scatterbrained thoughts on the situation as it is at the moment. So with that, what are we likely to see now? Well, we don't know. Following on my previous stream where I kind of delved into a potential Ukrainian counteroffensive, everything's up in the air about the Ukrainian counteroffensive. We're seeing the Ukrainians making use of the British supplied Storm Shadow missiles to hit targets of importance in, for example, particularly in Luhansk recently, but there was also a strike on Mariupol airport, which potentially looks like it might have been an assassination attempt of the Russian Minister of Defense, Sergei Shoigu, or at the very least, it looks like it might have targeted a Russian supply command bunker at Bakhmut airport. That seems to have been from a Storm Shadow missile. You have the ever-present HIMARS strikes on targets of opportunity of Russian logistics and Russian concentrations across the Zaporozhye axis, and not so much these days, but occasionally up here in Donetsk and Luhansk. You have Ukrainian drone attacks still trying to be as much of a pertinent irritant on various elements of the Russian strategic oil supply, particularly around Sevastopol and Tarnogog and Rostov area. So this to me sort of says shaping operations. Ukraine is trying to shape the battlefield for their eventual whatever offensive that might come about. We'll have to keep an eye out. So that's kind of what we're still waiting for. But in terms of the Russian side, depending on what happens with this counteroffensive, is the next area where I think the Russians, whenever they do go back on some form of offensive footing, I expect will be around Avdiivka. So as part of the Russian spring offensive, the Russians were able to take some territory north of Donetsk airport, but particularly to the north and northeast of Avdiivka. They took a number of settlements up here, and it looked like for a stage that the Russians might have been able to effect a complete encirclement of Avdiivka. Avdiivka is one of these symbolic situations for the Russians, but more particularly the DNR. Earlier in the war, before the Russians effected their breakout of Popasna and started to push out along, if I'm not mistaken, the thermal plant is along this area. No, I'm picking the wrong part of the front. So Avdiivka was taken by the DNR during the initial uprising in 2014. I actually think this is where Givi was active. I think Givi, if people remember Givi, the very famous Donetsk militia commander, I believe he kind of really made his name during the fighting in Avdiivka. Avdiivka was initially taken and put under control of the DNR. Then a Ukrainian army counteroffensive was able to retake the city. And then I think that part of that was what led up to the Battle of Orlivka. No, Debaltseve, that was it. It was the Battle of Debaltseve. I should know all this because I wrote a dissertation on it. Where is Debaltseve? There it is there. So there was a Ukrainian counterattack. I think it was roundabout into May, June, if I'm remembering correctly, in 2014, that retook Avdiivka. And then there was a point after the collapse of the Ukrainian positions in Debaltseve, where it looked like the DNR might retake the city, kind of like Mariupol. Avdiivka is one of these. It was held by us, but it was lost to the Ukrainian fascists, sort of locations for the DNR. Also, earlier in the war, as I was just previously elucidating to, before the Russians took these areas to the north, this is kind of the staging ground where our Ukrainian artillery would fire into Donetsk city itself. That is, so whenever the Russians started to push out here, the Ukrainian artillery pushed back. So it's kind of pushed Ukrainian artillery from the north of the city. That's a nice bit of a propaganda, moral victory for the Russians. And then it looked like at some stage during the spring that the Russians might have been able to encircle the city. They never, again, this is one of these examples where the Russians seem to come close to effecting a proper encirclement or kettle and kind of fumble the ball at the last minute. So there is a Ukrainian supply road that still maintains itself into the city. The Ukrainians, is reflected in this map, occasionally do counterattacks on the south. If I'm not mistaken, this is where the highway junction used to come in at. Or am I thinking down in Marianka? This is the area I'm thinking of. This is the old highway that was being constructed just as the 2014 war broke out. And this is like an overpass here where the Russians just keep getting hit by guided missiles vehicles. But the Russians are slowly trying to push out of the Pisky area, but they keep getting frustrated by entrenched Ukrainian positions. So if there's a position along the entire front where I think the Ukrainians are going to, the Russians are going to resume offensive operations at some point, I don't think there's anywhere else that really looks as favorable than Avdiivka. If they could try and effect an encirclement of the city, if they're going to decide to push into the city itself, we'll have to wait and see. I think I've said this enough times that you guys kind of all know it off by heart by this stage. I'm kind of critical of the constant Russian need to push in and physically fight and take over these cities and urban areas that they get meshed in months-long battles for, whenever they could just try and encircle it and just starve out the Ukrainians. I think that's a far more valid and better solution for the Russians that would save a lot more of their manpower, especially at the speed the Russians seem to be committed to progressing this war in their offensive operations with. But as you can see, Avdiivka is encircled by three sides by the Russians. This to me kind of says if there's a place where the Russians have the most favorable odds to next make a push, I think it's probably in Avdiivka. And then alongside this, I don't think the Russians are, at the rate the war is going, I don't think they're ever going to reach Sloviansk or Kramatorsk. I think we're probably going to have some kind of negotiated ceasefire long before that happens. But before that, what I could see is the Russians start to drift their attention away from these more northern parts of the Donetsk and Donbass front and focus on the remaining suburbs of Donetsk city that they don't control. So whatever remains of the apocalyptic hellscape that is Marianka, Krasnohorivka, maybe that will be the next focus for the Russians, who knows? Maybe the Russians will decide to bang their head against the door at Volhodar again and completely cripple and decimate one of their most elite divisions 3 times in a row. Who knows? But my eyes are on a Divka. Depending, of course, the ball's kind of in the Ukrainians' court. We're all waiting for this seemingly forever to come Ukrainian counteroffensive, but I think the Battle of Avdiivka is on the horizon. I think that's the next big one we'll be looking at coming down the road. Of course, all depending, with the big caveat, on Ukrainian counteroffensive. So, with that, I think that is everything of particular note to report and update. I am aware that the Russians are reporting they're making small gains in the up near Kupiansk, but I need to stop saying But as far as I am aware, there's been no other significant changes elsewhere on the front in terms of territory taken or fighting that has erupted in the since my last stream. I haven't heard anything else out of these Ukrainian bridgeheads on across from Kherson. I haven't really heard anything else on the Zaporozhye front, apart from the Russians continuing to extend their defensive positions. Everything apart from Bakhmut is sort of your more strategic weapon supply to the Ukrainians. Russian geostrategic actions. Though there is something somewhere in my mind, at the back of my mind, that I was meaning to talk about, but I can't remember it off the top of my head. So if it jockeys up, let's have a look at what you guys are saying. Let's see if there's any super chats. If anyone likes me enough, throw me a coin. Read out what the super chats say. What are you guys saying? Don't need me. Listen to you. So, dude, your PayPal link keeps saying this organization page is broken. Please fix it or stay broke. It's not working. Should be working. Let's have a look. No, it's working for me. Yeah, the PayPal link works for me. I mean, thank you for the offer of sending money. I hope you I've been able to, but I'm not too sure why it isn't working for you, because it's working for me. It's one of the ways he manages to stay impartial. He can't be bought if your PayPal doesn't work. Yeah, I guess so. I wish some of these governments or intelligence agencies that people keep saying I'm obviously shilling for or engaging in psyops on behalf for would send me the money, because I'm not getting paid by them. My paychecks, MI5, SVR, FSB, SBU, they keep getting lost in the mail because I'm not getting them. The Linktree one worked. You can use it. I'm assuming that means you've sent me a nice dono. Thank you very much. It's greatly appreciated. Thank you so much. No pressure, Michael, but I convinced my mom to watch this stream. Oh, okay. Hello, Maureen's mom. Sorry for the apparent audio issues. I feel like I should have put more effort into the stream now if I'm entertaining Maureen's mother. Michael should start by yelling the M word repeatedly to show Maureen how based her. Maybe on Odyssey, not on YouTube. Good evening, it's fine here. Bunker housing for 20 Swedish krona. Thank you so much. Let's get a shout out to Maureen's mom. Yes, everyone. Give thumbs up for Maureen's mother in chat. Any word on Gonzalo? No. But I'm sure, as most of you know, not a big fan of Gonzalo. I only really look at it whenever it happens to cross my feed. But we'll give quick Google. I don't expect we will hear from him until his trial begins. And I don't think we will actually ever I don't think we're going to be hearing specifically from Gonzalo in a long time. Because he's looking at 8 to 12 years in a Ukrainian prison. Let's have a look. News. Apart from some like Indian rehashing news site, there doesn't look like there's anything beyond the initial reports of his arrest 2 weeks ago. So the next we're probably going to hear about CRP is whenever he is physically up in court contesting the charges. And I mean, if you guys have ever watched any of his stuff while he was in Ukraine, I think that he's pretty dead to rights. He's going to prison. It's a question of, are they going to give him a light sentence and deport him, which means he'll probably get about 4 to 5 years in Ukrainian prison, or are they going to completely rip him apart and send him down for 12 years? That's probably the next we will hear from our good friend CRP. Who knows? Maybe I'll write to him in prison and see if I can get him to pay for the beer food that he ordered and then ran out without paying the check on. It's also of note that all the people who really came out batting for Gonzalo last year don't seem to this time. Again, with the caveats, I don't exactly make a habit of watching the Duran, Ritter, etc. But I haven't seen much from them, at least being shared in chat or elsewhere, calling for the release of our good friend, Coach Redpill. Have you heard from Ben Frott? Well, I don't make a habit of messaging him often because obviously if he's physically fighting on the front, I think the last thing he wants is some weird British person to constantly badger him with questions. So I keep it very offhand, my interactions with Ben, because again, a man who's fighting in a war probably has better things to do than ask and answer my autistic questions. But in fact, let's have a look. I messaged him May 4th, so a couple weeks ago. He seemed to be doing well then. So obviously with the expectation of what's going to be happening on the Ukrainian side in a couple months, I'll send him like a keep well, keep his head down kind of message. And then maybe after the culmination, I might ask him again onto stream for that. God willing, he is alive. But otherwise, I again, like I say, the guy is literally fighting this war. You know, he is living this day to day. The thing that I talk about and make comedic comments about occasionally, it is his lived experience. I don't think I just feel bad if I was badgering him while he has artillery raining about him and gunfire coming down on him. If I'm badgering him with Telegram messages, so mic is weirdly stereo. Once I finish this, I'll take down this stream, I'll edit it into a video and put it up, and I'll have a look and see what the audio sounds like, because as far as I can tell, I've changed no settings, and the OBS settings seems to be perfectly okay. So and switching occasionally, but completely understand. Listening on the phone speaker. Yeah, I'll have a look at the audio once I finish this. I think armor was used at least at the end to pound AFU, Ukrainian Army Armed Forces, with direct fire, though in small amounts compared to SPG's mortars, howitzers. Yes, so there were certainly some T-90Ms that were operating in Bakhmut. There is video footage of that. I think one of them got damaged, potentially destroyed. But there was definitely T-90Ms on the Orchestra side that were operating in Bakhmut at occasions, but they were very few in number, and I think it was probably wise because Ukrainians and the Russians on their side had drones constantly over the city, and the tank's a big thing, and especially whenever it fires, it draws a lot of attention. So I think if they brought in a lot of armor into the city, it would have brought down a lot of Ukrainian artillery on top of it. So they seem to use their tanks very sparingly on the Russian side, as you say, in very specific direct fire roles. And what we've seen a lot more of instead was your artillery and your RPGs and sometimes self-propelled guns. Well, you're not self-propelled guns, your recoilless rifles, which they would take into apartment buildings and buildings to shield them from drones and artillery fire themselves to engage hard Ukrainian targets. So I fear as soon as Orchestra leaves, the city frame will take it back. Well, again, I am completely nuanced, unbiased, impartial observer of this, so I can't really say fear or whatever. But I doubt it. It's the conductor says his men are pulling out pretty much today and over the next couple of days. But they're not just arbitrarily pulling out like his previous threat a week ago to just drop and leave the city. They are pulling out in the sense that whenever a Russian military unit comes up to their position, is they will swap out with that Russian military unit. So the city is slowly being handed over to the Russian military. So I don't think it's going to be a case where the Ukrainians can just sort of slip back in and retake the city. I don't really think the Ukrainians would want to do that at this stage. So that's yeah, I think the city is now the newest member, the newest urban center, completely destroyed, that has entered the Russian Federation for the near and future. So need to stop saying Russia and Ukraine's best man wiped out. No. Like I say, a lot of the bulk of the losses on both sides are very much your second-rate troops, and on the Russian side, I expect the bulk of their losses are your literal scum from the streets, your penal colony volunteers, which, you know, if a bunch of rapists, thieves, and killers decide to go off and die for the motherland in the fields of Ukraine, is that really a loss to Russia? But I do think in terms of the orchestra, their professional losses is probably going to sting them for a while, which I expect is probably why they have decided to completely disinvest from Ukraine and focus on their operations in Syria and in Africa, because those are a lot less intensive, probably a lot more profitable for the conductor and the organization in of itself, and at this stage would probably gather more strategic benefit for Moscow rather than wasting that in terms of some kind of grinding tactical battle somewhere in Ukraine that goes on for months. But also, while doing that, I would expect that the orchestra will reconstitute itself. It will take in a lot more recruits, rebuild its strength, and train up the outer core of the organization. So, depending how long this war goes on for, I expect you'll still see orchestra in small numbers, probably popping about here and there, and maybe in a year's time or so, you will see them re-engage in a larger fashion after they've reconstituted their forces and kind of just relaxed and rebuilt after pulling out of Ukraine for a bit. So that's kind of where I'm looking at it. And on the Ukrainian side, definitely some good veteran units have been whittled down and some losses taken, but the bulk of the Ukrainian losses will be your sort of territorial defense battalions. You know, capable if you put them in a trench with competent leadership, but they're not the people who are going to be leading your offensive operations or really effectively equip themselves. If you put them in a trench with a rifle and, like I say, a good competent commander, they'll probably hold that trench depending what's thrown at them, but they're not going to charge into and retake Lysychansk. They're your kind of filler units. It wasn't the situation where the Russian military completely was ground down to dust in Bakhmut, or the Ukrainian army, as what a lot of pro-Russian commentators seem to suggest, that the Russians were going to Verdun Ukraine in Bakhmut. That hasn't come about. A lot of men have been killed, don't get me wrong, but again, you're talking the Ukrainian military's potentially got, at this stage, you're probably talking well over 1 million people under arms. That's not 1 million people on the front, but, you know, but you've still got people coming in through the draft and conscription and volunteering. And then on the Russian side as well, you've got potentially up to 800,000 men who are actively engaged in some form or another at the front, behind the front, in support operations, whatever it may be, across the Chechens, the DNR, the LNR, the Russian official military, Rosguardia, the Orchestra, other private military corporations, because we all kind of focus on the Orchestra because it's obviously the most prominent, but there are a number of Russian quote-unquote mercenary outfits that are operating in Ukraine. You bring together all the pro-Russian factions, you're probably approaching 1 million men as well on their side that are operating. You know, potentially 60,000 people, and let's say conservatively, let's say 20,000 Ukrainian killed, 30 to 40,000 Russian killed. In the grand scheme of things, out of that figure, it is a fairly sizable chunk, but it's not the army has collapsed because it can't fill manpower anymore. Do you think there will be a ceasefire soon, or will Russia go for taking Novorossiya? Russia is not going to take all of Novorossiya. For people who are not aware, all of southern Ukraine, all the way up to Odessa, sometimes including Dnipro or not, but all of eastern and southern Ukraine is what is considered to be quote-unquote Novorossiya. This was kind of the grand goal, dream of the initial 2014 rising. This is what was kind of hoped for had the uprising in Kharkov and the rising in Odessa succeeded, is this sort of pro-Russian breakaway, quasi-independent or completely independent new Ukrainian state to be absorbed into Russia would come about. The Russians are not going to take Novorossiya. Novorossiya, at least in the near to long term, is not a feasible proposition. I do not see how the Russians are going to get back across the Dnieper, to take Kherson, to take Nikolaev, to then get across the Bug River, to then push down to Odessa. I did a video last year while the Russians were in Kherson, but there was a lot of people just telling me arbitrarily that the Russians, it's only a matter of time till the Russians take Odessa. No, even when the Russians were in Kherson, there is a lot of obstacles between the Russians and Odessa, and there's even more now. I don't see how the Russians are going to get back across the Dnieper. So Novorossiya is not a feasible proposition. They can go for the next best thing, which is this here, but I mean, Novorossiya is kind of, it's cancelled anyway because they just outright annexed these territories into the Russian Federation. So that's, I might do a stream on that because I've had some thoughts about that. Was it wise for Russia to annex, or could they just have set up a alternative Ukrainian state? That is a different, that's for a different stream. Do I think there'll be a ceasefire soon? It depends on the Ukrainian counteroffensive. Depending how that goes. If the Ukrainians get completely stopped dead, if they lose a lot of men and material and the counteroffensive really achieves nothing, I think that's whenever Western powers will start to reassess their views, and they'll probably tell the Ukrainians, we'll give you one more chance. Offensive in the spring. Not in the spring, in the autumn. And if you can't really achieve anything then, when can you achieve it? Maybe now's the time to start looking at some kind of diplomatic road now. Or if the Ukrainians take a lot of ground and then the Russian line collapses or whatever. But if the Ukrainian offensive doesn't really achieve much, I think the Russians will then start to consider another offensive on their end. And if that doesn't really achieve anything, I think that's whenever both sides will start to come to the idea that maybe it's time to start some kind of talks. Not peace talks, but probably a ceasefire talk. The idea I've had for a while is more or less where the lines are at the moment could be where they solidify, and the conflict could be frozen in the way that the conflict in the Donbass between 2015 and 2022 was frozen, where fighting largely bogs down to just some kind of supervised OSCE mandated ceasefire where you'll have the occasional artillery duel, maybe skirmishes here or there, but kind of like the Donbass war, but on a larger geographical scale. Why do you think both sides were scrapping over so long and hard for what? Again, I think it was just the emotional and symbolic and political investment in the city rather than the strategic. For the Russians, the strategic and tactical value of the city really was lost when they lost Izium and Liman. For the Ukrainians, I mean, ideally for the Ukrainians, well, urban center is always a good defensive position, so it was a defensive bulwark in their line. But whenever the Russians really started to get into the city, maybe it was time to just pull out and set up a new defensive line in the hills behind the city. Was Bakhmut worth it to inflict the high casualties on Ukrainians that they did? I don't think so. I think the Russians probably spent too long and too much for what. Again, I don't want to rehash what I said earlier in the stream, but I think it's a Pyrrhic Russian victory. Pro-Ukrainians will still say Soldar. Wouldn't Orchestra plea for ammo have been disheartening for other troops? Why should they secure an area only to be discarded? I'm not too sure specifically what you're saying. I mean, that was the argument the Russian MOD kept saying, was that we are expecting a Ukrainian counteroffensive. We're trying to stockpile ammunition for wherever it may fall. You can't really keep supporting this offensive operation, which is expanding far more ammunition than it otherwise should be. But Orchestra man using Bakhmut for his own campaign, is that why Russian MOD? Yeah, I mean, it's a whole ethereal topic in of itself, but the factionalism that goes on in Moscow between the conductor man and the MOD, and then different figures within the Siloviki, unless you're a part of it, you probably don't understand it, and I don't speak Russian fluently. I don't have any deep insights into insider politics in Moscow between the different powers struggles that might be going on and factionalism that goes on there. I have a very general view of it, so I couldn't really comment too much on it. But the way the conductor has ironically conducted himself throughout this conflict, to me, it signals that he is building a domestic political base in Russia, but he is alongside that trying to build up a lot of political capital with the presidency, because outside of what it says in the constitution and all this, all political power in Russia comes from the president. If you are on the good side of the president, you go up in political power and prestige and your standing. If you fall out of on the bad side of the president, out of Putin's favor, then you lose your power and essentially you fall out of a 12th floor apartment block window. Is it true that Wagner is going to peace? Said it again. Is it true that the orchestra is going to peace off to Africa and Syria now? That does seem to be it. The other thing, I was planning on putting a part of this stream, but this stream's gone on long enough. But I am going to do a dedicated stream on Syria because there's been a lot of things that have been happening. This is why Pepe with Based Bashar is in the background there. There's a lot of developments going on in Syria at the moment that I think deserves its own stream. Maybe I expect that the orchestra is going to go and wrap up some ends in Syria, but I think their big target now is Africa, particularly the Central African Republic, Sudan, and Mali. That seems to be the big inroads where the orchestra is now focused on. And potentially it's also kind of the big place where Moscow can really start to make some strategic plays in its favor outside of Ukraine. But so many Ukrainians were lost in Bakhmut that their spring offensive has been delayed. I don't think that's it. Certainly some of the units earmarked for their offensive were diverted to assist in Bakhmut, but the Ukrainian offensive hasn't been delayed because of Bakhmut. It's been delayed because they're going by what I am able to deduce is they're trying to scrimp as much as much material in terms of tanks and weaponry that they can from the west. This Storm Shadow, I think, is a signal of that. Is they're constantly trying to winkle out ever more sophisticated and longer range weaponry from Western powers to try and stack the odds as much as they can for their counteroffensive. Because I'm not rehashing my stream from last time. Go watch my previous stream if you want me to go into it. But generally, an attacker has to have a 3-to-1 combat power advantage over a defender. That could be in terms of physical men, could be in terms of the advantage in their weaponry and the forces they can bring to bear. I'm not seeing how the Ukrainians can get that 3-to-1 advantage over the Russians, especially on the Zaporozhye front, where we're all expecting it to come, because Russian Air Force can operate here a lot easier, and Russian artillery operates with an advantage in this area. So that's more against the favor of the Ukrainian combat offensive, and as each week and day goes on, the Russian defenses in this area deepen and lengthen in depth. So the Ukrainians are scrimping about as much as they can to try and get anything and everything that they can put in their favor. Don't forget the offensive on Kherson was projected for 4 months in advance before it actually began. That's because the Ukrainians went out of their way to shape the battlefield as much as possible and to get as much equipment as they could from the west as possible. I don't think the offensive has been delayed because of Bakhmut on the Ukrainian side, because the units largely involved that we expect to be involved in the offensive, while they're largely the units that were involved in the fight for Kherson, and we haven't seen them really since Kherson. I know it's hard for people to believe and stuff, but there is an entire Ukrainian army group that is not in the fight. It has been resting, relaxing, and rearming for at least 6 months. Stuff about Stalingrad. Yeah, well, I mean, this idea that, I mean, the city offers nothing to the Russians at this stage as a logistics hub. All the rail and road infrastructure have been wrecked by the fighting. I mean, I get, yeah, the Russians can repair it to some degree, but I don't think the Russians were looking to use this as a logistics hub. The city was tangential to the road in the original Russian plans for the area. It was all about the road to Kramatorsk and Slovyansk. That is what the Russians were after. But as I have said a number of times, whenever the Russians lost in the Kharkov counteroffensive, Liman and Izium, the northern flank of the Twin Cities, Bakhmut lost its strategic imperative to them. The whole Russian effort for the city going in was the road. It's whenever they got invested in the fight for the city that it became a symbolic and a political thing for them. That's what kept them in the fight. I just lost all the chats. Ritter and Gonzalo beefed, didn't they? Yes, they did, quite famously. Why did you mod Maureen? Was Maureen's based bad build? He gets an idea of what should be allowed in chat and what shouldn't. Keep your damn party. Enigma for $20 US. Thank you so much. Only wanted to send prayers to the soldiers and thank you for keeping us informed. Thank you. I try to. Thank you so much for the $20 US. That's very generous. Heavy losses. Do you think the drama between the conductor and Russian was a psyop? Seemed legit. No, I think it was legitimate. Some elements of it, like the conductor telling the Ukrainians insider Russian military information if they left Bakhmut. I think that is probably getting a bit ahead of itself. But there's been factionalism in Moscow for years, and I don't think the conductor would go out of his way to broadcast to the Ukrainians that his men are having as much trouble in the city as they are, if there wasn't an actual problem that he had tried to rectify, going to the MOD itself and going back to Moscow to rectify it, and then just getting rebuffed. It's been even the Orchestra Telegram groups from the members of the group itself, they all say the same thing, is that they have great relations with the Russian military at the front, but it's the behind the lines commanders, and particularly it's whenever you get into the politics back in Moscow of the MOD, of Gerasimov and of Shoigu, that they find real roadblocks and they have serious problems and animosities with the Russian military, which stems back to the start of the war, because the whole reason the orchestra got involved in Ukraine to begin with was the abysmal performance of the Russian army last year. I could probably go back in the Telegram channel and find them, but there was, particularly during the opening stages of the invasion and going into the summer, is the orchestra were extremely critical of Russian commanders, and particularly after Kharkov, I can distinctly remember reverse side of the medal and the gray zone, the two big orchestra telegram channels, they were calling for Russian generals to be shot after Kharkov. And there was even an incident where there was a Russian infantry unit, I think it was a battalion-sized unit, who, it sounds strange to say, and I don't know if it actually happened or not, but they put out the video, but there was a Russian battalion that effectively defected from the Russian army into the orchestra. Quite how that worked out administratively, who knows, but they refused orders from their divisional command, the Russian army divisional command, and they said, no, we're not accepting your orders anymore, we're only going to accept the orders of the orchestra, we want to join the orchestra. I never knew my dad and girls weren't interested in me, but Gonzalo helped me understand bonding with girls through game theory and Machiavellian. It hasn't yet worked, but I know I'm red-pilled thanks to his fatherly advice. I plan on sampling 2 women a week. Then it just happens that this wise, wonderful man also enlightened me on how the Kremlin was super based and Kremlin is hacking West. I had a feeling that was going to be a bit of a comedic post. It was Gonzalo who beefed with Ritter for some reason. I think it was Gonzalo thought Ritter was not enough pro-Russian. I thought it was because, like, he said that he got beheaded or something. Who knows? But I'm sure you all know my opinion of these people. These like overly optimistic pro-Russian Western commentators who say that there's like chlamydia weaponization, biological weapons plants underneath Azovstal, or American generals are being killed in their dozens by Russian strikes, and the Kharkov counteroffensive was actually a Russian feint, and all this kind of stuff. I think you all know very well my opinion on these people, and Obviously, I have personal beef with Gonzalo. Well, I wouldn't call it beef, but I have a personal funny anecdote about Gonzalo from my experiences from him. And Scott Ritter is a convicted P word. I don't think don't want to go too much into it, but yeah, that's my opinion of those two in particular. So don't really shed any tears for either. And not only that, is Ritter, despite his constant claims that Ukraine is on the verge of collapse for a year now, is conveniently turned up in Moscow to further cement his impartial vice credential. So, with that, is there any other messages, or dare I say, any other super chats someone wants to quickly throw in? I'll have a quick look. Or while I start to wrap up the stream. So we're going on 2 hours now, so I'm going to round it down unless anyone else wants to fire something at me. So as soon as I finish this stream, I'm probably going to take it down and edit it into a bit more of a cohesive video and re-upload it as a video. I think that's probably the way I'm going to go about it from here on out, is stream, edit down into a video, re-upload the video onto YouTube and the Odyssey. And I probably need to look into that Rumble stuff as well. So, how's the thumbnails? Do you like the thumbnails? I think if there's anything I've significantly improved on, I think it's my thumbnail game. I think they're looking pretty nice, if I do say so myself. Soon, maybe the streams themselves might look as good in quality and artistic flair as the thumbnails do. Learn a new skill. Learning new skills, chat. Bunker Housing for another 220 Swedish krona. Thank you so much. But McGregor, you give your insight on him. I honestly don't know anything about McGregor. I haven't watched any of his stuff. And I mean, my sort of sector of Ukraine commentary, it kind of, the people I sort of comment on are the ones who are a bit more, they get involved in funny drama that I can sort of laugh at and poke fun at. As far as I'm aware, Colonel McGregor is pretty straight-laced. I haven't watched his stuff, but I've not seen, I've seen some reports saying he's a bit too pro-Russian. Can't personally say that at all, so I can't attest to that at all. But I haven't seen anything saying like he is a convicted, he was convicted trying to meet a child, or he ran a internet dating service on how to pick up Ukrainian hookers in Dnipro, or he was convicted because he defrauded an illegal teeth whitening operation in London. You know, like that's the kind of funny stuff that draws me to the other commentators on Ukraine that I have passed comment on. Or he hasn't come to Ukraine and spaffed up almost $50,000 up a wall in a strip club in Lvov, claiming he is fighting in the international battalion, or he is a transgender pro-Russian genocidal journalist troon. You know, they're the kind of funny, hilarious, what WTF kind of people that if I do pass comment on in the sort of commentary community on Ukraine, I sort of focus on. As I've said a number of times, the only person I really go out of my way to watch is who does Ukraine stuff, so it doesn't overly bias my take on what I see through the Telegram channels, is Perun. And yes, Perun definitely has his views, but his channels, from my estimation, they give a very good sort of overestimation in terms of like the defense economics side of things. But I haven't watched his videos in about a month or so. So that's the only person I really go out of my way to watch whenever I do watch it. So I can't, unfortunately, I apologize, but I can't give you an in-depth insight into Colonel McGregor. But he does, from what I have seen, he does seem to be a lot more grounded and reliable than Scott Ritter seems to be. looking to kick. Also good for live streams, much better than Odyssey. I don't want to get into like 20 different social medias. That's the thing. The thing is, I would stream. I need to sit down someday and look at the widget for OBS that allows me to stream on multiple platforms. But sure, PP, check PP. Oh, PayPal. Okie dokie, I'll look into that. Thank you very much. I'm assuming that means that there's a nice juicy dono someone's thrown into my PayPal. Thank you so much. On that, I'm going to take this moment to do a quick chill. Super chats are always greatly appreciated. Thank you so much. They are greatly appreciated. They help keep this stuff sustainable. But with the caveat that super chats, YouTube does keep 30% of them, and you do fund YouTube by sending them. If you are of the mindset where you would like to send me something to keep me afloat, PayPal or Coffee is probably the best example, with a slight leaning towards PayPal because they don't really take a fee. That's my personal preferred method because Subscribestar just doesn't seem to want to engage with me at all. I don't want to go onto Patreon, and I'm not very keen on locals, but who knows, maybe I'll have to go on the locals. But that's kind of the best way to go about it if you don't want to fund, what's his name, Nourish or whatever his name is, the guy who now runs YouTube. But yeah, but thank you very much. I will look into that. Thank you, it's so generous. If you want to grow the channel, then find a good format which is information dense and full of juicy speculation. 15 to 20 minute videos. Yeah, I know I need to play up the thing. I just kind of prefer the streams because I do them off the cuff, and they're a lot easy to do, and I get to interact with you guys a bit more. But I have slowly been working on the tank video. Who knows when that'll come out? The war will probably be over before I actually release a standalone dedicated video. But so with that, I think that is everything on that end. So we'll just come into the final shills. If you like the stuff that I do come check me out on Twitter. This is my Twitter account. There is a butterfly for some reason flying about my computer screen. Go away. So don't really focus too much on Ukraine on this stuff. I am posting a lot about Fish Tank. I'm obsessed with Fish Tank, but do go follow me on Twitter if you happen to be on Twitter. I'm also on Instagram as well, but instead of just linking all that, the link is in the channel the video description below. Please do go check out my link tree. I'll take you to all my accounts on my various platforms. I would appreciate that, and thank you very much for everyone else who does that. I would say like and share this, but I'm going to take this stream down pretty much as soon as it ends and edit it up into a more cohesive standalone video. So, well, I guess if you watch the stream, you don't really need to watch that. But if you do like this stuff and feel it's of a bit of worth, I wouldn't mind if you mind sharing this with other people you think might get something from this. The Telegram account, the various YouTube, the Odyssey, yada yada yada. With that, we've narrowed it down to just over 2 hours this stream, which considering these things used to go on for 3-4 hours. I think I'm making progress. In whittling down, considering like 10 minutes at the start is the opening video, so we're getting there, chat. Soon it will be a speed run. I'll have the entire thing done in about 5-10 minutes. But with that, thanks very much, guys, and I will be back with you soon. Probably a serious stream, talking about based Bashar and what's been happening in the Arab world in regards there, and how it relates to what is happening in Ukraine with Russia. So with that, thanks for coming. Appreciate it all. Thank you to the super chatters and the donators. Thank you. Very, very generous and very appreciated, as little or as much as it is. And I will see you guys soon. Bye bye. Paka paka. Auf Wiedersehen.